Today is Monday, January 17th, 2022, and this is episode 260 of the Defensive Security Podcast. Yes, my friends, you heard that right. It has been less than 6 months since the last episode. High fives.
Wow.
I know. My name is Jerry Bell, and joining me tonight, as always, is Mr. Andrew Kellett.
Good evening, Mr. Bell. How are you, sir?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
I'm good. Nobody can see us, but you got this fancy new setup going on. Like you got like a boom mic, you got a new camera.
I do.
Getting all fancy. Have you been moonlighting on other podcasts without me? Is that what's going on?
No. I actually have been thinking about doing more podcasting on other topics like behavioral economics.
This is why you're fun at parties.
Totally. All right. Just a reminder that the thoughts and opinions we express on the show are ours and do not represent those of our employer, although, as Andy is want to say, they could be yours if the price is right.
It's true. We are very, very viable.
All right. So getting into some stories for today. The first one comes from CSO Online, and the title is "Thousands of Enterprise Servers Are Running Vulnerable BMCs, Researchers Find." So if you set aside for a second the fact that this story comes from a company whose focus is on firmware security, it's actually a pretty interesting aspect that I think a lot of companies don't really pay enough attention to. And the story here is talking about a attack / piece of malware called ILO Bleed. ILO, for those of you who are, I assume most people know, is the integrated lights out function in HP servers. But most all servers actually have some kind of baseboard management capability. And typically their security is absolutely awful.
I don't know. A lot of kids today are cloud only. They probably never heard of this craziness.
Well, the cloud, the cloud at the end of the day runs on servers that have BMCs. So
that's true.
But yeah, it is been kind of a laughable disaster. I know we've talked about some of these in the past, but in this particular case, this is talking about an attack by a presumed APT actor who has found a way to load some malware into at least some versions of ILO to wipe disks. So kind of a new take on the disk wiping destruction malware that we've seen in the past.
Yeah, it's especially nasty because this is a firmware device that's meant to sit outside of the operating system and give you a secondary functionality to control the box, right? It's a remote admin tool, basically. That's on its own NIC. It's on its own network interface. It's often has its own power, so it can be operational when the actual main machine is offline and powered down, which is great for all sorts of hands-off, remote administration. Not so great when the bad guys find it and start abusing it.
Exactly. And so this company, Eclipsium, says that they've identified about 7,800 of these ILO ports accessible from the internet, which is super convenient. It makes me a little mad because, there's a really stark shortage of IP addresses, and here we are.
Right, and this is a separate physical network interface card.
Yeah, they had to try. I mean, this wasn't an accident. They had to try.
How does that end up internet facing? I don't I should answer my own question with realizing that lots of craziness happens, but
yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Well, firewalls are risky and all that stuff. So over the years, there has been just an absolute dearth of BMC vulnerabilities. IPMI itself, the IPMI protocol itself had a pretty serious vulnerability a couple of years ago. And, it's really not gotten better from there. And in general, you're really beholden to the server providers fixing vulnerabilities. And, and especially as hardware starts to age out, the likelihood of a hardware manufacturer continuing to provide updates, starts to decline over time. So,
yeah, because everybody updates their ILO firmware. Come on now.
Well, I guess that's the point of the article is
right
that you really do need to be aware that this thing exists and it presents a threat to your environment. And they point out that, by the way, the only way to exploit this isn't necessarily just through that separate port. If, for instance, you have administrative credentials on the host operating system, typically there's some capability to manage the firmware in this BMC computer, which again would potentially allow a downgrade attack or just to load malware that's not detectable from within the operating system. So there's no CrowdStrike agent that runs in your ILO or other server manufacturers' equivalents.
Yeah, it's also interesting. Like these ILO ports typically are on their own discrete network, should be at least, for use by the server team. But they're rarely scanned by vulnerability management in most enterprises I've seen. They're rarely in asset management. They're kind of like out of sight, out of mind, and probably not being included on a lot of patch and firmware update cycles because they're probably not getting picked up by typical vulnerability management tools.
Yeah. So I was talking with Bob about how he manages the risk of this because realistically, if you have any meaningful number of actual physical servers, there's a new vulnerability almost as soon as you turn the power on, right? So, and again, not all these things are capable of being fixed, or again, there are protocol vulnerabilities that just that can't be fixed. So one of the things that Bob does is actually turn off the network port at the switch until the time that someone needs to actually interface with that port. So
that's smart if you remember to do that.
Yeah. It's all automatable, right? It's what he said, at least.
Well, yeah, until it's 2 a.m. and you get a pager call out and you're like, why can't I get to the ILO port? You forget to turn the switch port on. No, that's pretty clever, though. Like, it keeps them offline until you need them.
Fair enough. Yep, absolutely.
Though, if you are doing vulnerability management scanning on those ports and they're down, you're not getting a read on their versioning. But
that's the downside.
It's a clever idea. I like it.
In some instances, you can actually see the again, not all types of servers. This is a capability, but you'll be able to see the firmware version of the BMC from the server, right? So, like, you'll have the ability to apply firmware updates through, let's say, Windows or Linux.
This, as a quick aside, though, this has always made me curious. Like, the OS front end NIC is usually well thought about and well architected as to what network segment it goes in and the firewall rules that are let through to it and all that sort of jazz. For things like backup networks and ILO networks and this sort of stuff, typically that's not thought out. They're just thrown in one big-ass broadcast domain and away they go. And I wonder how much that could be abused by an attacker if they could ever get access to that management segment and just go to town.
It would, in many organizations, I think it would be pretty disastrous.
Because they're not, you think your servers are segmented, but you're not thinking about, that backup port to the backup machine isn't segmented.
Right.
It's all in one big /22.
Yeah. And, everybody thinks about, that network has all sorts of precautions on it. So, of course, we're okay with accepting the risk of, let's say, some vulnerability. But heaven forbid somebody finds a way in there. It's, it can walk all over the place, potentially.
Yeah, it's just one of those architecture things that one more thing for security folks to not forget about when they're thinking about how all these networks function and different ways a attack could function through or move through laterally through your environment.
Absolutely. All right, our next story comes from CSO Online as well, and the title here is Cybercrime Group Elephant Beetle. Wow, sounds impressive. Lurks inside networks for months.
I think that needs to be the name of a cover band. The Elephant Beatles. I got to work on that.
Fancy. So this story here is really focusing on the P in APT. They're describing this elephant beetle threat actor who finds a way into organizations' network, typically financial services companies or apparently online retailers. They're leveraging typically Java-related vulnerabilities on web servers like Primeface's WebSphere and SAP NetWeaver. And what's I guess a little bit unique about them is after they use this the Java vulnerabilities, they're uploading web shells relatively innocuous looking in the same directories as other parts of code, typically named in such a way to be unnoticeable, right? So that it's custom tailored to the environment so that it looks like it belongs. Then once they're in, they spend some amount of time, potentially months, at first establishing lateral movement capabilities using a variety of different open source and custom tools. They said about 80 different tools. And then they spend, after they've moved laterally and have a decent foothold in place, they actually monitor the flow of money. They monitor how transactions happen. So this is kind of my view, a blended attack, right? They're attacking IT vulnerabilities, but then they're watching how the business processes work, and then they start injecting fraudulent transactions, small amounts at a time. And that's as compared to other threat actors in the past who do something similar, but then they'll shoot their shot all in one go, trying to steal, hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars at the same time, where this threat actor is trying to stay kind of below the radar and over the course of months or longer steal effectively the same amount of money.
Yeah, I think, didn't we cover this in Superman 2? Portions of pennies?
Something like that.
I think Office Space also covered this as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's interesting because they get in there and then they look around and get to know the environment and then very slowly get themselves in a place to execute a very low and slow attack.
And so they talk a bit about some of the lateral movement capabilities they use. They apparently rely a lot on hard-coded credentials that exist in source code. So for instance, they talk about collecting database passwords from web server code that lets them access Microsoft SQL servers, and if those servers are not configured, well, to try to laterally move into the database servers and other systems. In particular, they point out that Microsoft SQL is a target of opportunity using credentials that they've captured to try to create additional user IDs, typically in an Active Directory domain, which, then at that point it's kind of game on.
It seems there's lots of opportunity for detection here, though, if you've got really good awareness of your environment and have a lot of time to note things in the logs, which not a lot of people have, but it's somewhat noisy as they move around.
Yeah, there's they actually give a list of items to detect, and they're not all detections, but a list of things you can do to help protect against this. But by the way, I suspect this is not the most prolific threat actor out there. Apparently, it's somewhat focused on Latin American organizations. But the thing that concerns me is like everybody and their dog is reading all these tactics, and so it's quite likely we'll see other other threat actors who may have different motives also adopting some of these techniques. But anyway, the things they said to look for are making sure you keep your applications and operating systems up to date. Pretty obvious. Avoid using clear text credentials and scripts. Just talked about that. Avoid using the same password for different administrative interfaces on different servers. That, by the way, is I found remarkably common problem in a lot of organizations. A lot of companies have certainly password complexity requirements, but not a lot of organizations have a requirement that says you have to have a different ID on or different password on each system. It's a little less common. Obviously, when you get into something like Active Directory, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But there you have it. Avoid using XP command shell procedure and disable it on Microsoft SQL servers. Monitor for configuration changes and usage of XP command shell. Monitor on war deployments and validate that the package's deployment functionality is included in the logging policy. Hunt and monitor for presence and creation of suspicious .class files. Hunt and monitor for presence of creation of web pages and static resource folders. That's one thing, by the way, that always struck me as an opportunity is using something like file integrity monitoring to look for changes to your web application directory trees. Somehow, obviously, you'd have to smash that up against when you push code, when you push website changes. But this is it doesn't seem like rocket science, I guess.
No, but it takes a good correlation of what is normal behavior from your web devs and your monitoring team. So you're not just getting alert fatigue from, well, we got an alert, but I don't know if it's real or not because I don't know what they're doing and it takes too much effort to go talk to them. And yeah, you need to have a close association with those teams to be able to figure out what's normal and what isn't as they do their thing. Now, there's ways to do that just from monitoring and getting to know those environments, but that takes a lot of analyst time and energy that often they're chasing other things. But I agree. It's a good thing to do. It just takes cycles.
Yep. Say monitor for processes that were executed by either the web server parent server processes or database related processes. So, looking for things like your web server launching cmd.exe as an example. And then finally, making sure that you're properly segmented between your server networks and your internal networks. Really fairly standard fare there.
Yeah, unless they just move on to the ILO network and just go lateral that way.
That's what I would do. All right, next story comes from ZDNet. Title is When Open Source Developers Go Bad. Next on Fox.
Oh boy, this was a big Twitter kerfuffle too.
Yeah, that's the reason I don't hang out much on Twitter anymore. Can't handle kerfuffles like I used to be able to. So the story here is that a person named Marak Squires was the maintainer for two particular JavaScript applications or code libraries or whatever you want to think about them. Colors.js and Faker.js. Pretty easy to guess what each of them does. The Faker.js, for those of you who can't figure it out, creates fake data for your application to use. But these are pretty popular. Let's see, Faker.js was included in 2,500 NPM programs and had 2.4 million downloads per week. Colors.js was in 19,000 other NPM packages and downloaded 23 million times per week. That's kind of big. And so the author here apparently decided he was done with his contributions to society being used by companies making money, and so he altered them to create an infinite loop. So any application that included these and updated to include the latest version effectively stopped functioning. So it was pretty, I think, pretty eye-opening for a lot of people that this was not the same situation we've seen in the past, where either the maintainer sold the repository to some malicious person, or a repository was compromised by a malicious actor. The actual author, legitimate author, apparently took this action. So really highlights the supply chain issues that we have going on, but adds another complexity that even legitimate players can be the threat actor.
Yeah, and there was a whole bunch of debate of what to do about this that I saw, and whether or not this guy's account was suspended and then it was unsuspended, and these were deleted and reverted, and did he have the right to do this, and what are the expectations for those who are using the tools to not be subverted like this, and what are the licenses around free open source, and if this guy had the right to do this, and just a whole bunch of philosophical debate around the open source movement. But at the end of the day, we've got a whole bunch of commercial organizations using these tools, and it screwed up a whole bunch of stuff. And I don't know, is this going to be an edge case? Is this going to happen more often? Certainly you can do some things to run. Once this was known, it was easy to detect and stop, but it's an interesting problem because there's a whole bunch of infrastructure and application development built on this sort of thing that I don't think a lot of people realize.
Yeah, I mean both other open source and closed source as well, almost certainly. I hadn't heard of any impact on closed source software, but I'm sure that there's something similar out there. But this again is a big a symptom of a much larger problem we have with source code supply chain, right? We have a very, very complicated problem. We have implicit trust all over the place, and that I don't know, most people I assume likely know, but like with NPM and JavaScript, like there are the average application can have like tens of thousands of dependencies. There's a lot of opportunity for shenanigans and for problems to arise. And the alternative is not very appealing. I mean, on the one hand, you either have to continue trusting implicitly, or you have to either stop using it, or you have to have something in place that assesses the quality of all the code. And I don't think most organizations have the wherewithal to handle the latter. It is just too much code out there.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, there's tools out there that will do some fairly basic checking of if a package is vulnerable or malicious and that sort of thing, and alert you before it's, if it's used in your environment. But again, this was the maintainer themselves subverting the code in such a way that caused basically a denial of service. Once that is known and you have a tool that is updated and you could be alerted to that, okay, that's fine. But you're basically back to the old days of AV programs where you're waiting for somebody else to get hit by it. Hopefully you get your DAT file updated before you see the malicious code. It's a tough problem because there's so much, like you said, implicit trust built on this sort of open source package availability. And I don't, we certainly cannot go back to hand coding everything independently.
No,
that's just not viable.
No, it's not. And it does point to the importance of testing, right? And in this particular case, obviously, if you had tested, you would have detected that your code went into an infinite loop, and that would have.
Yeah, in this case, but there's so many times it's such a subtle problem.
Right.
I mean, what's your test? This is an obvious thing to test and detect, but somebody bakes in a very quiet back door. How are you going to pick that up in testing?
No, that's a good point. Good point. There's certainly going to be cases that you really can't, and it does again highlight the point of, or the importance of some of the emerging tools around code quality. But again, even that is, I'm sure, is pretty dramatic blind spots. So
yeah, it's a tough problem. I don't have a lot of good solutions in this one.
Watch this space.
Yeah,
I honestly think this area is going to be one of the most one of the areas that has the most significant development in terms of new organizations, new companies, new products, and whatnot in the coming couple years. Be my guess.
Fair enough.
All right, so moving on to the last story here from Bleeping Computer. Microsoft resumes rollout of January's Windows Server updates. So this was, for those of you who are Windows shop, quite annoying. Last Tuesday was Patch Tuesday. One of the vulnerabilities in particular was critical and was declared potentially wormable by Microsoft themselves. It was a protocol flaw with their HTTP protocol driver, and allowed potential remote code execution, and again, unauthenticated and potentially a wormable kind of vulnerability, and was patched before any kind of worm was released, which was good. Unfortunately, the patch caused quite a lot of chaos in some versions of Windows Server 2019, 2022, and a couple of other versions, particularly in domain controllers. It would cause a boot loop.
Look, if the box is booting, it can't be wormed.
Well, it's true. It's true. If it's not running, it cannot be compromised. I can only assume that was the thought here. There were a few other vulnerabilities fixed and a few other problems, like apparently it caused was it ReFS, the resilient file system, to be corrupted.
So you might call it slightly less resilient.
Slightly less resilient, yeah. It also caused problems on Windows 10 and Windows 11. Apparently broke some L2TP VPN capabilities. So I know that in the aftermath of the deployment, there's a lot of consternation. Like, what do you do? Like, you have this super apparently seeming critical vulnerability with a patch that's known to hose your environment. What do you do? And for I think for most of us, the answer was test, and if it caused a problem, you had to find a way to mitigate the issue.
Yeah, it sucks because we need good quality patches, and we know that patch velocity matters. We know that the bad guys start reverse engineering these patches very quickly. And so when this happens, it really undermines trust in Windows patching. And it's very unfortunate because it's, I've always kind of been on the record of patch early, patch often, and this undermines that, and it
Absolutely.
breaks more than it fixes.
Absolutely.
So that sucks. I mean, I think you're going to damned if you do, damned if you don't, but I would be very curious statistically how often, like, we have a lot of anecdotal cases and we remember them, but what's the percentage over time of how many of these Windows updates break stuff to the point where you've got this kind of thing? And is it high enough that we're going to slow down patching to do extensive testing, or let other people do extensive testing and make sure they're not broken? Or do we just keep trusting them blindly? I don't know.
Yeah, it's, on the one hand, it's greater than zero, but on the other hand, it's something that we still talk about, and therefore it's not happening every month, right?
Versus if you don't patch and you get hit by an exploit. Yeah. Which is the higher risk.
Yeah.
Now, we think about things from an exploit perspective, so we might be biased in one direction. So I'd be curious of the statistics. Now, if you're a sysadmin and your job is more about keeping systems up and stable and, functioning, you're going to be much more sensitive to that risk. And it's balancing those two that makes this job hard.
Yep, that's absolutely right. All right. Well, that is the show for today. Appreciate everyone's time. Look forward to talking again soon. Any parting thoughts?
You can follow me on Twitter at Lerg, L-E-R-G. Jerry is occasionally on Twitter still at Malicious Link. And our show can be followed at Defensive Sec on Twitter. Yep. We do try to keep an eye on that. I, like Jerry, have kind of slowly drifted away from Twitter. It's just got a little too hostile at times, just a little too much tension out there. It's not good for my blood pressure.
That's right.
But I do love to hear from folks, and I'm happy to interact. I shy away from all the politics these days. But otherwise, really happy you guys are still with us. Thank you for listening. Hopefully the shows are valuable to you, and hopefully we'll talk to you again very soon.
Take care, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.